Hi everybody, welcome back to English 221. This happens to be for our class for Wednesday, and that is the 26th of January. In last class, I introduced the syllabus and course outline, and you can see those documents in our syllabus and other documents folder. I didn't have a chance to talk about plagiarism, so I wanted to just briefly mention plagiarism and then move forward and talk a little bit about Shakespearean biography today. So, in terms of plagiarism, I'm sure it's probably something you've heard of in other classes. The use of somebody else's language or ideas without acknowledging the source. And it's a pretty serious offense. It's comparable to theft, but it's academic theft. If you were to be caught, and there is a possibility that you might not be, if you were to be caught and you got off easy, so to speak, you would fail that assignment. If you didn't get off easy, you could actually be expelled from the college with a notation on your transcript indicating that you plagiarized. So I oftentimes liken it to the IRS, in that if you do get caught, you are in a whole bunch of trouble. And I found that plagiarism is usually pretty deliberate, that an individual is, for instance, downloading a paper and attributing it to themselves when they haven't written the paper. It's certainly not a question of making an error in regards to documentation for putting, let's say, the wrong punctuation in a particular area when you're documenting. Plagiarism is usually pretty deliberate in an attempt to deceive. And I always have two stories about plagiarism that I share to encourage, hopefully, students who might be tempted to plagiarize not to plagiarize. And if you'll remember, when I had talked about the assignments for this upcoming semester, they are not research assignments, though, of course, there is some room for negotiation if you did want to do research assignment. But the reality is that my hope is that at the ending of the semester, you have some comfort with being able to read Shakespearean works, so that in the future you can approach a work that we haven't covered in class and be able to make sense of it. So the kinds of writing that we will be doing, they're known as critical papers, where you're relying on your own interpretation based on your own understanding of what we've discussed in class in your own reading, rather than doing outside research. So hopefully that would decrease, let's say, the possibility or the temptation to plagiarize. But my two stories. The first happened to me in the very early days of my teaching career. That would be in the early 90s. So this was pre-internet. And I'm reading a paper and I realized that it sounds familiar. Now, as many sources as exist on the internet to help students plagiarize, an equal number exists to help professors determine if students are plagiarizing. One of my favorites is Turnitin.com, where I could type in a sentence and there's an electronic search. But since this is the early 90s, I couldn't rely on anything like that. I needed to use my memory. And we tend to be pretty well read as teachers, so I knew I'd seen this before. I just couldn't put my finger on it. But I didn't have to think long and hard, because I realized that what I was reading was actually from the class textbook, the book that I had actually assigned for class, as if I wouldn't notice. And there were a few errors in there, a few spelling mistakes. I don't know if this is because the person was a sloppy plagiarist, or they were hopeful that if there were a few errors, I wouldn't attribute it to plagiarism. But that's not the best story. The best story happened around the same time period, pre-internet, to a middle-aged professor. This part is important. This appeared in all the academic newspapers, so there is such a thing as academic newspapers. And this middle-aged professor is reading a series of papers, realizes that something that he's reading sounds quite familiar. And again, not being able to rely on the internet, he had to rely on his memory, wondering, where have I read this before? Where have I read this before? And then he realized he hadn't read it, he wrote it. He had written this 30 years earlier when he was an undergraduate in college. And it was basically one of his old papers that had been recycled. And I don't know all of the details, but it has something to do with the fraternity that was recycling papers. So basically, this student was unfortunate enough to actually get a hold of a paper that his own professor had written decades earlier and submitted it into the professor. I don't usually feel sorry for people who plagiarize, but I think I feel sorry for this particular person. What are the odds? So at any rate, those are my two stories about plagiarism. And as I had indicated in terms of Shakespearean biography, and also our next class, Shakespearean stage, I don't have any readings assigned because I wanted to basically give you some information and also give you some time to read. Because as you will see, starting on the 2nd of February, we will begin with Shakespeare's sonnets. So what you should be doing is reading those sonnets so that by the time we get to the 2nd of February, you already have them read while we are discussing them. Likewise, on the 9th of February, we are beginning our first major play, which is A Midsummer Night's Dream. The idea is that you are doing the reading ahead of time so that by the time we get to that point of the 9th, you've read A Midsummer Night's Dream as much as possible in its entirety as we talk about it over 2 weeks. And of course, you're at home preparing for the next play. And this is how the semester will go. But in terms of Shakespearean biography, there are a good number of questions about Shakespeare's life and a good number of questions about the authorship of his plays. And I was able to find a documentary online that I thought did a fairly decent job of giving at least some biographical information, as well as some of the theories that exist about Shakespeare. I have my own impressions about this documentary, and I certainly have my own opinions about Shakespearean biography that I will share with you next class. I didn't want to necessarily contaminate you. The biography is approximately an hour long, so I'm going to keep this video very short and ask you to watch it. And the attendance question for today will be based on that Shakespearean biography. My question to you is after watching that, do you believe or do you think that Shakespeare was the author of the works attributed to him? And why or why not? Because one of the things that the documentary will discuss, in addition to biography, is the authorship question, because there have been some questions in the past about whether or not Shakespeare was the true author of his particular plays. And again, I'll share my impressions with you next class. So I hope you enjoy the documentary, and you can see the link is below in our notes. And at the ending of that, you can answer the attendance question, which won't be due until Friday the 28th at 8 a.m. If you need additional time, please let me know and I'll be happy to grant it to you. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class talking about Shakespearean biography, the Shakespearean authorship question, and also Renaissance England and the Shakespearean stage. Take care. Bye-bye.